For decades, it seems like the Middle East has been synonymous with conflict, right? But if you really want to understand why, you've got to look way beyond the headlines. We're going to try and untangle this incredibly complex web of history, politics, and power. So let's just dive right in.
So, let's start with the big question. Why? Why is this part of the world so often in turmoil? You know, the easy answers you always hear, oh, it's just ancient hatreds, or it's all about religion. They just don't cut it. They're way too simple. The reality is, well, it's messy. It's layered. So to help us make sense of it all, we're going to lean on a pretty simple metaphor, the spark and the tinderbox. We're going to look at the spark that lit the fuse, but maybe even more importantly, we'll look at the tinderbox itself. What made the whole region so incredibly flammable to begin with?
Okay, so let's start with that spark. Our story really kicks off in the early 2010s. You probably remember it. This incredible wave of protests, uprisings, and full-blown revolutions just swept across the Arab world. We call it the Arab Spring. And unbelievably, it all started with just one person.
This phrase, Ashab uridu iskat an-nizam, it means the people want to overthrow the regime. And it became the anthem. You heard it chanted in the streets everywhere from Tunis to Cairo to Damascus. It was this powerful, unifying cry. And the moment that lit this fire, it was in December 2010. A Tunisian street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, a guy with a university degree who couldn't find a decent job, he set himself on fire. He did it to protest the constant harassment and humiliation from local officials. It was an act of pure desperation, and it was caught on video. It went viral, and boom, it was the catalyst that ignited a revolution in Tunisia and inspired millions, and I mean millions, across the entire region.
But here's the thing about a spark, right? A spark can't do anything on its own. It needs something to burn. So that brings us to the tinderbox. What was all this fuel? What were these deep systemic pressures that had been building up for decades that turned the entire region into this political powder keg just waiting for a match?
Well, it was a whole mix of things, all tangled up together. You see, for years, a lot of these authoritarian regimes had this kind of unwritten deal with their people. It was basically, hey, we'll give you subsidies for things like food and fuel, and in return, you just, stay out of politics. But by the 2000s, that so-called authoritarian bargain was falling apart. You had this huge boom in the youth population, and governments just couldn't create enough jobs for them. At the same time, you had insane levels of corruption, with all the wealth stuck at the very top. This just created this massive sense of inequality and injustice.
I mean, look at this number. By the end of 2008, youth unemployment was at 25%. A quarter of all young people couldn't find the job. Just let that sink in for a second. We're talking about a whole generation of educated, ambitious young people with literally no future. And they're seeing the children of the elite living these lavish lifestyles all over social media while they can barely scrape by. The level of frustration was it was a ticking time bomb.
And this is so important to understand. Yeah, the economic situation was a huge part of it, but these protests were about something so much deeper. This slogan, chanted in Egypt and Tunisia, it just says it all. Bread, freedom, and human dignity. Bread, that's the economy, right? Freedom, that's the politics. But that last part, dignity, or karama in Arabic, that might be the most powerful piece of the puzzle. It was about rejecting the daily humiliation of living under these corrupt, oppressive systems. It was a simple, profound demand to be treated like a human being.
Okay, so you have the spark and you have the fuel, but the fire didn't just stay in one place. It started to spread. And that's because powerful countries in the region saw all this chaos and thought, this is an opportunity. They started fanning the flames, pouring gasoline on these local conflicts to push their own agendas. And that's what turned these uprisings into absolutely devastating proxy wars.
And to really get this next part, we need to talk about sectarianism. Now look, the split between Sunni and Shia Islam goes back centuries. It's a real theological divide. But a lot of analysis, like what's found in the ADSU Journal, argues that the conflicts we see today aren't really about religious doctrine. It's about how that religious identity is used. It's a political tool. Governments use it to rally their people, to justify their interventions, and to score points in their geopolitical games.
And that brings us to the two main players in this game, the regional heavyweights. On one side, you have Shia-majority Iran. On the other, the Sunni powerhouse, Saudi Arabia. And their goals are polar opposites. Ever since its revolution in 1979, Iran has been playing what it calls forward defense. That means building up a network of allies and proxy groups, its Shia axis of resistance, to project its power and push back against the US-backed order in the region. And Saudi Arabia? Its main goal is to protect that exact order, to keep its own regime safe by containing Iran wherever it can and positioning itself as the leader of the Sunni world.
And this clash of ambitions has had tragic, devastating consequences. It's turned countries like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon into proxy battlegrounds. This rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia has basically poured gasoline on fires that were already burning. They arm and fund opposite sides, they deepen those sectarian divides we talked about, and they turn what started as internal political problems into these massive international wars with just unbelievable human suffering.
All right, so now we need to pull the camera back even further. Let's zoom all the way out to the global level. Because none of this, the domestic problems, the regional rivalries, none of it happened in a vacuum. The stage for all the conflict we see today was in many ways built decades ago by outside powers, especially during the Cold War.
This quote from Professor Fawaz Gergis is so on point here. He basically says that this whole idea of ancient hatreds being the cause of everything is a myth. And it's a convenient myth because it lets Western countries off the hook for their own role in creating instability. For decades, U.S. foreign policy was all about two things: controlling oil and containing the Soviet Union. And that often meant prioritizing stability over democracy, which really just meant propping up friendly dictators. I mean, just look at this history of intervention. Back in 1953, the CIA helped overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister and put an autocratic Shah in power. The animosity from that one event is still felt today. Then you have the Eisenhower Doctrine during the Cold War, which was all about supporting conservative monarchies like Saudi Arabia to fight back against Arab nationalism, which Washington feared was too friendly with the Soviets. And then in the 80s, the U.S. backs the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets. A good idea at the time, maybe, but it had these massive, unforeseen consequences, empowering Islamist groups that would go on to change the entire region. Every single one of these actions had a reaction, and it all built up this legacy of mistrust and instability. So you see, there's no single easy answer. It's not one thing. It's this deeply entangled web where the local problems, the regional power plays, and the global history all feed into each other.
And Syria is just the most tragic, perfect example of how this all works. You start with the fuel, domestic protests against the brutal Assad regime. Then comes the fire. Regional powers jump in. Iran backs Assad, its key ally. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states back the Sunni rebels. And finally, you get the architects. Global powers like Russia and the US get involved, backing their own sides for their own strategic reasons. And just like that, a local uprising becomes one of the worst wars of our time.
So, if you take one thing away from this, let it be this. You have to see all the layers. You can't understand what's happening in the Middle East otherwise. The internal problems, the corruption, the lack of jobs, the yearning for dignity, that created the tinderbox. The regional rivalries, Iran versus Saudi Arabia, they lit the fire. And decades of global intervention helped build the whole flammable structure in the first place. If you only look at one piece, you're always going to miss the real story.
And that really leaves us with a pretty sobering thought to end on. We've seen how all these forces, politics, economics, history, are all tangled up. So what happens when you throw brand new existential threats into the mix? Things like catastrophic climate change and severe water shortages are already starting to grip the region. How is that going to interact with this already incredibly volatile web? That is the question, and the answer, whatever it is going to shape the future of the Middle East for generations.